Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 755, May the 26th, 1986. Last week I was talking about a gentleman who is attending Cabrillo College up in the Santa Cruz area, not far from here, who was told by a person in the offices across the street that arranges student loans. He was told, we have a problem in Ethiopia, we want to take people out. And that was the message, and he also identified himself, strangely enough, as being in the CIA. I spoke to this gentleman. His name is Mohammed Kalish Lay, or L-E-I, Lee or Lay. He was born in New York State and moved to Africa. His mother had relatives and associates, friends there, and many of his early years, informative years, from 20 on were for 6, 7, 8 years, were in Khartoum in the Sudan and also in Ethiopia. He told me the area that this food product was to be sent over that would kill large numbers of people there, it was around Lake Tana. It's, if you take Khartoum and Sudan and draw a line down and then straight down, it's the northern part of Ethiopia towards the border on the west side. And interestingly enough, the program was to put the poisons into spirulina and algae. Well, that rang a familiar note, and I'm not saying all spirulina or the algae that is being promoted for the third world is going to kill somebody, but many of you long listeners remember when I first met Larry Flynt, and he had everyone at his house at the table and around there taking spirulina and algae, and I saved those because I was very suspicious at the time, and he said, oh, go on, take it. Everyone at the table was taking this stuff. Later I found out that what he was handing out, which was allegedly made up at Crater Lake in Oregon, actually was produced by a man from Mississippi who is a high officer in the Ku Klux Klan, and they were supplying Larry Flynt with this spirulina and algae. And you see what happened to Larry Flynt when he began to get too political around 1983. There is a court case filed in Monterey County on this, and I'll keep you up on it and let you know if there's any more that happens. It was thrown out of Santa Cruz counties where the court case was filed on the 6th of May, and a case was thrown out of Monterey County in the favor of this party because of the connections and threats that were made to him. So I'll let you know more about that. Also, I referred quickly just last week to a body of a man missing from Fort Ord that caught my interest. It was in the Monterey Herald, April the 30th. It just said, man lost in surf identified. The body of a missing Fort Ord man has not been recovered, but his name was released Tuesday. He was identified as Harold O. Nwawe, N-W-A-W-E, 27. He swam in the surf into the beach right below Fort Ord. It's below Stillwell Hall. The public information officer said a 2-hour search for his body by the Army was unsuccessful. He had only been at Fort Ord a few days. He was at the base personnel control facility awaiting an administrative discharge, and I'm not sure what that is. He was picked up by the Oakland police for a traffic violation. They returned him to the Army, and he discovered he was absent without leave. He survived by his parents of Zaria, Z-A-R-I-A, Zaria, Nigeria. And I have a friend who worked for IBM for 10 years, and after that training, and he is black, he was told that he was expected to spy it was Nigeria, that country, for under the auspices of IBM. The American corporations use people to spy, and they're not suspected of being, because they're part of the repairing of the equipment and the computers and so forth. And he refused to and left the company when he was told that he would have to spy against other black people. He's black, and ever since that time his life has always been endangered, and he's followed and threats to be killed and so forth. People from various corporate world have kept track of him all over the world, because once he turned this down, after all that training, they're earmarked, and terrible things do happen to them. I noticed this last week that the Senate okayed export of unapproved drugs, which goes along with sending food over there that is not cleared or checked for the safety of the individuals or the recipients, by a vote of 91-7. A bill put through by Orrin Hatch allowed that the Food and Drug Administration could send drugs over to other countries that have not been tested for their safety. Senator Howard Metzenbaum was furious about this. California Representative Henry Waxman and Ted Kennedy were objecting to this. It allows drug companies to sell medicine not approved in the United States to 15 so-called, what they call the first-tier nations, but they could also send it to the second tier, and then it filters on down, and they, of course, could send it to the third world, and a lot of this could be experimental or genocidal. The first-tier nations that could receive it would be Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, West Germany, Finland, France, Japan, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. But once they get it, the second-tier countries can get it, and then it can go on down and reach people who have no way of knowing that these drugs were not allowed in the United States because they were not tested for being safe. Now, I want to discuss a few people who are in and people who are out, because I won't go into great detail about these subjects. I want to go through them quickly. There's so many, but there's a lot of shifting sands, and behind the Libyan affair or the Sudan government changing hands, or the possibility of Reagan attacking Iran or Syria, there are other major things going on simultaneously that are very, very important, because they involve the decision makers and placing people in strategic positions. Those people who are out that I'm going to talk about briefly are William Wilson, the president's envoy to the Vatican, Michael Deaver, and his new problems that are surfacing by the Bush, what do you say? A basket full? I fill a wastebasket? No, not a basket full. Michael Deaver's papers are almost equal to the raiding or the bombing of Libya. There's so much on Michael Deaver. For all purposes, he's out. George Bush, cancer of the mouth, surgery this past week. I don't know if it's serious or not, but it's a sign that something could be later, and cancer, I believe, is often and most likely a political disease. Those on the in team are Mr. Harry Schultz, Frank Wiesner, Alexander Haig, Paul Laxalt, and John Agresto, and I'll talk about them just briefly. Now, Ronald Reagan is very close to William Wilson. As you know, if you've listened to World Watchers or read your papers regularly, he went to visit Gaddafi right after, the month after the bombings at the airports at Rome and Vienna. He won't say why he was there, and the powers that be have insisted, I suppose, that he leave now. He says he's leaving voluntarily. He's Ronald Reagan's closest friend on the staff, next to Deaver, who's out. So Ronald Reagan, the emperor's clothing, or the Teflon part, may be coming apart from Ronald Reagan. In some ways, it is apparent that there's a lot of pressure going on in Washington at the present time. He denied that he had a role with Pennzoil, that they have dealings in Libya, but he won't say why he was over there with Gaddafi. Wilson is our first ambassador to the Vatican in more than 100 years, a very close personal friend of Ronald Reagan's, a close friend who tried to intervene with Paul Marcinkus, the secretary of the Vatican Bank, who is for all purposes kept in hiding because of the various scandals and deaths related to the Vatican Bank. So William Wilson is out. We don't know who the new envoy will be, but nobody was closer to Ronald Reagan than William Wilson, as I say, Michael Deaver. Now, interesting story in the Washington Times about Michael Deaver. There's been, as I say, so many things about him, but this is particularly interesting. The article is titled, they probe Deaver's use of information. The various accounting offices, General Accounting Office, and members of Congress are going into his access to the President of the United States and his role in and out of sessions where he could help his businesses that he linked up to later in Korea, Saudi Arabia, with Rockwell International, all over the world. Hong Kong, he's been very influential in building up a vast empire in 1 year that he was almost ready to sell for $17 million after 1 year. Now, this article in the Washington Times, April 9th, said that Mr. Deaver's access to Reagan is unusual. It is extraordinary. If there's a person in and out of this government with overall closeness to Reagan, I'm confident it is Mike Deaver, said Lynn Nofziger. There's no reason in the world for the Reagans to have him over for Christmas dinner, be like family, except that they are very close friends. That's one point that is noticeable, and as I say, Michael Deaver is now out. His pass to go into the White House or to play tennis, where you can't bug the tennis court as the ball's flying around and so forth, and meet people at the tennis court. He has lost those rights. and he's being pushed physically and every way away from the people in the White House. The second point that this article brings out, that Mr. Deaver's relationship with Nancy Reagan is viewed with some bitterness by many of the other original key supporters and former staff members of the president going back to the 1960s. One early associate said Mr. Deaver endeared himself to the First Lady by feeding her penchant for being treated as royalty. Well, he set her up with a castle in Vienna after the Bitburg occasion with Mr. Weizsäcker, the president of Austria, and he has tried to treat her with like royalty, which is what she wanted. But Barbara Honegger, who was in the White House in the cabinet meetings and served the Reagan administration for 2 years, said Deaver was the gopher between Nancy Reagan and the White House or the cabinet. He was the man that represented her will or her wishes, but it seems he was more than that. And the article goes on to say how much power he got helping Nancy Reagan. The third point is, this article says, Mr. Deaver played an important role through Mrs. Reagan in the president's appointment of James Baker as White House Chief of Staff in 1981, and he helped get rid of Alexander Haig, Mr. Reagan's first Secretary of State, and former National Security Advisor Richard Allen. Deaver versus Haig and Kissinger hold their power base, and Deaver is out of the White House. That's the job that Haig took over at the time of Watergate as Chief of Staff of the White House, but he's still functioning on the outside. Then this article says William Clark, who originally hired Deaver in California, was also exiled from the White House to the Interior Department last year. Ultimately, he left the administration, and he worked with Mr. Deaver and in collaboration with Mrs. Reagan. William Clark brought Helene von Damm to this country, and when Nancy Reagan got angry at Helene von Damm and she was sent to Vienna and then told she would no longer be the ambassador to Vienna, Deaver was representing Mrs. Reagan at that point, and rightfully she was suspicious of Helene von Damm. Now, the box in the article that I'm leading up to says Mr. Deaver said it was his role with Mrs. Reagan to protect the president, particularly from the far right. Now, von Damm was one of those far right, and far right, I believe, is the Third Reich. That's the far right, the real original Fourth Reich that we have gone into that stage. And his role was to protect the president from that element. Deaver being out now, William Clark being out now, von Damm is very nicely connected in Austria, and if Kurt Waldheim becomes president of Austria, which I doubt the way it's evolving now, there would be this very, very strong power base in Austria. And more about the Austrian connections later. Then the article goes on to say that Deaver plays out and helps Mrs. Reagan by feeding her information about people that she can use her intuition, that she has a feeling, and he checks them out for her. The article says Mr. Deaver also has found his White House service made him particularly a target of the conservative critics. Now keep this in mind when you think of Deaver in Bitburg or Deaver in Saudi Arabia or South Korea, that there are even more conservative people than Deaver that are pushing Reagan to this, out on a branch to this far, far right. The article says Mr. Deaver said he constantly had to work as a moderating force within the president's inner circle and guard him from policy actions or misjudgments of his more conservative supporters. First of all, I think Reagan is a moderate man, Deaver said. I never believed he's so far to the right as the conservatives would have him to be. And I see now how the conservatives push the Bitburg, you've got to go to Bitburg, which, while Reagan is bad, that's really out of character to what he was in California. He was bad, but the Bitburg and honoring the Waffen-SS was just the top of the badness and symbolic in a lot of ways. This article goes on to say Deaver thought Reagan was compassionate by nature. I would always try to accentuate that in him rather than those who would like him to be more strident. And that's the takeover of Tom Buchanan moving into the White House and Donald Reagan, after Ronald Reagan was shot, and running the White House with this strident, awful tone that is accelerated with operations such as bombing Libya and then getting ready now to invade Nicaragua. Deaver said, let's say I always laugh at the line, let Reagan be Reagan, which was aimed at me because I tried to do that for 20 years. He said it was his role and Mrs. Reagan to protect the president, particularly from the far right. I am by nature a suspicious person, he said, and Reagan is not. He always thinks the best of everyone. I would be suspicious of a person's motives, and when it came to him, he wasn't, and I was there to protect him. And all I think I did, if anything, for him was to guard his flanks, which Nancy does, and that's consistent with this right wing. And he goes into meeting Mr. Nakasone, who personally asked Deaver to arrange a visit at Camp David, and so forth. And then it goes into when Ronald Reagan was shot, and by John Hinckley. And this article goes at length about the shooting of Ronald Reagan and how the importance of Deaver coming in. He said it was this dramatic gunning down of Mr. Reagan by would-be assassin John Hinckley on March 30th, 1981, that catapulted Deaver into public prominence as one of the president's White House troika. By his new out-front role, it was really another Deaver-devised public relations gambit to show that the president was operating from his bed, even though he had been shot, to show the continuity that the president was still in charge and everything was fine, particularly after the statement of former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, "I am in control." They, Mr. Baker, Meese, and Deaver, decided the way they would reassure the country was by very consciously, conspicuously going to the hospital every day, having a stakeout by the press outside the hospital, and you'd have the White House cars arrive and important advisors get out and, quote, unquote, meet the president at the hospital to discuss national issue policies. And so this was the role of Deaver when Haig said, "I'm in charge." And shortly after that, by June 82, Haig was out. But Haig and Kissinger and their boss Fritz Kramer and Daniel Graham, his partner, the head of the High Frontiers in Star Wars, are waiting on the sideline. And interestingly enough, at great length, this article tries to explain what Deaver was doing. Now, it may be that Michael Deaver built a $70,000 salary in the White House to the ability to sell his company in 1 year for $17 million to a British corporation. And keep in mind the strong links of Kissinger Associates to Lord Carrington in London and the London base of Kissinger Associates. It may have been a payoff of this firm to keep him quiet about George Bush and John Hinckley and the people behind the assassination attempt of Reagan, that he survived. Nancy isn't very dumb, and this man he could make $17 million after leaving 1 year out of the White House. So there's a lot behind the amount of material published about Deaver, and you have to read it very carefully. As I say, his White House pass has been taken away, and William Clark is out, and Ronald Reagan, the emperor, just about stands naked and bare. Now, the New York Times had a story about last week, May 21st. But this week, it's State Department versus the Defense Department. A rare public fight erupts after Pentagon report on Condadora. Now, Ronald Reagan would be killed by the Somoza people and army if he doesn't invade Nicaragua. John Kennedy was killed by the same people who were the Bay of Pigs operation when he didn't invade Cuba. So he's up against a rock and a hard place, and his protector now, Deaver, is gone, as is William Clark and the entourage in the White House that were protecting Ronald Reagan. Now, just this last year in 1985, there were a barrage of articles wanting to get George Schultz out of office, and a lot of them were run by the far, far right. This is Arnaud de Borchgrave and the Washington Times pushing these articles out. One was Oust Schultz Movement. You remember those in September of 1985, that Schultz is too liberal, get him out, that we don't want his mouth, his talking soft on communism, and we have to get rid of him. The Washington Times, Reverend Moon's newspaper, and Arnaud de Borchgrave as editor, had a full-page story September 17th, 1985, with big black letters, "Mr. President, you have been badly served by your State Department. Ask George Schultz why he did not give you the whole story of Samora Machel." And this was about Mozambique and the People's Republic of Mozambique and the relationship of Arafat with the PLO, and the story of a lot of Cold War fighting between the conservatives and the State Department, and a full-page story of trying to get him out of the State Department. Then a week later, another full-page ad, and of course, Reverend Moon again, tax-deductible church, a newspaper, the Washington Times, has a full page. President Reagan should fire Chester Crocker. Schultz policy makes U.S. principal Soviet ally in Marx's Mozambique. And they have a picture of George Schultz and Assistant Secretary Frank Wisner, Deputy Assistant Secretary Frank Wisner, and Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Chester Crocker, which they say are Marxist-Leninists supporting them. Now, Mr. Frank Wisner, and I'll go into him 1 second, has just been appointed by the darling right wing of becoming the new ambassador to Egypt, just where there could be a coup momentarily and Mubarak would be killed. But George Schultz was very unpopular. And then all of a sudden, within a short time, that was September of 1985, Schultz becomes the hawk. And I cited this one article just a few weeks ago with the Libyan raid, LA Times story, big, large headlines. Number one hawk favors combining power and diplomacy. Libya raid, a triumph for George Schultz, the number one hawk in the State Department. So from September to March of this year, September last year to March, mealy-mouthed George Schultz became the hawk they wanted, and now if he begins to bomb and attack and send the troops, he's okay, but he's under as much pressure. Not that Reagan is perfect, but they are being pushed by an element that is hinted in that one article about the relationship of Nancy and Deaver and how they remove these forces and how Ronald Reagan is in danger of the right wing. Now, another man who's been promoted to a very sensitive area that is on the fringe between the military dictatorship we put in for 23 years in Brazil and that very thin democracy that took over after Tancredo Neves was murdered in Brazil, the same Harry Schauderman, I put an L in there all the time, who was down in Allende and played a role in the murder of down in Chile, who played a role in the murder of Salvador Allende, who's been in Central America. He's a protege of Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, and their mentor, of course, Fritz Kramer. Harry Schauderman has just been named by Ronald Reagan to be the new ambassador to Brazil, which is like putting salt into a wound. As soon as Tancredo Neves was murdered in Brazil, and there was this takeover, and Mr. Sarney ran as vice president, although he worked with the military until a year before. The democracy is trying in some way to hold on and not appear as a military dictatorship. And then in came Kissinger Associates and William Simon, a Knight of Malta, Vernon Walters, a Knight of Malta, to help with the financial problems in Brazil. And this will tilt our government and our embassy to a very dangerous man. The National Reporter had an article in their issue summer of '85 that just came out, sabotaging the Contadora process. And it begins, we have Trump, the latest Nicaraguan Mexican efforts to rush the signature of an unsatisfactory Contadora agreement, elated a recent UN National Security Advisor. Secret background papers were revealed October the 30th, 1984, National Security meeting attended by President Reagan. The initiative, put together by 4 countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, was stopped. He said, we have Trump the latest. We've stopped their efforts. It was signed, this paper, by U.S. Special Envoy for Central America, Harry Schauderman, Secretary of State George Schultz, and other diplomats to not allow any kind of a peacekeeping treaty in Central America that would, of course, it wouldn't be agreeable to Nicaragua because they understand what is happening. But this same man who was bragging at these meetings of having stopped this process, nipped it in the bud in 1984, 2 years ago, is now appointed to be the new ambassador to Brazil by Ronald Reagan. Also, another scandalous article about Brazil was in the Wall Street Journal this past week. Brazil is seeking Morgan guarantee account names. Now, this has to do with flight capital and breaking the back of this new fragile democracy, and Brazil wants information on the Morgan Guarantee Trust Company, the accounts, because the money went through 6 people. They're talking about $6 million that left Brazil, and they use the term of flight capital, which is what Adolf Hitler was good at doing in Japan after the war. taking money out of the country, so if the country's going to fall or the election isn't in your favor, there's no money left when you get into power. This is what Marcos did in the Philippines, and this is a history throughout the past era for 40 or 50 years of flight capital. The article's about Brazil's central bank trying to get a list of the Morgan Guarantee Trust Company accounts and the funds because the central bank determined that a particular gentleman was holding the money for 6 people, and $6 million in funds has gone. It's in the hands of fewer than 6 people. Capital flight in recent years has been less of a problem for Brazil than countries like Argentina and Mexico. Nevertheless, they want this money back. It is stashed abroad, and Morgan Guarantee Bank was the instrument for this happening. Interestingly enough, Morgan Guarantee Bank is the banker for Advanced Genetic Sciences out in Oakland that is supposed to be a small company using the live bacteria on food substances, but as I've said before, it's part of Roman, Haas, and international corporations. But Morgan Guarantee Bank is the bank that is responsible for the funding of AGS out here in California. I'm sure that they use a lot of other big banks, other places, but on their brochure that is mentioned. Now, another important appointment, this is coming up this week that is very, very critical to researchers who wonder why I go beyond the grassy knoll and study the interconnecting links of various people and countries to unfolding our history and the control they have over information, such as the UN locking up the list of 40,000 Nazi criminals. Then Kurt Waldheim was just one of them. The big fight going on is about who will be the U.S. archivist, and the only one that I see writing articles about it, again, is the Washington Times. March the 10th, they had a story, can't they agree on a new archivist? And the story says the Office of the United States Archives isn't something that brings mobs of people around. Why can't they come to an appointment? Just 10 months ago, an archivist resigned. His name was Robert Warner. The post has been vacant for 10 months. Now, for researchers working on just the John Kennedy assassination, that's when I got a little bit of familiarity with the National Archives, and then a lot of other important information, of course, is in the National Archives. But killing the President of the United States is as important as anything I know. It's in our best interest to know that person is objective and releases information that all of us can share and doesn't try to protect one part of the power system who cut their power by political assassinations. So March the 10th, there was an article about the kinds of people, the archivists that they would like. One professor, M.E. Bradford, was a strong Reagan supporter. He was recommended by Paul Laxalt, by Bill Buckley, Russell Kirk, and so forth. And you can see that kind of a nomination, how wonderful it would be to have them, a man like that, deciding what we see and what we can't get. Then there was another article, April the 7th, 1986, in the Washington Times. Haggling marks the pick of the new U.S. archivist. And then the New York Times service ran a story finally, March the 21st. Historians are stacked against the U.S. archivist. Now they've picked one, and some people are objecting. And now is the time to write to your congressman if you don't like this person. President Reagan named John Agresto, Agresto, as the archivist for the United States history and documents to be in charge of these. There is fear that Agresto might again politicize the archives by bending to executive branch wishes to withhold records from the scrutiny of scholars. They also contend he lacks appropriate professional credentials. He's the one that Ronald Reagan is pressuring. If he gets the nomination, don't release the Richard Nixon tapes. The article goes on, the main concern of the opponent to Agresto is the apparent partisanship of this appointment to a position in which tough decisions have to be made, sometimes regarding the president office. Experience has shown that these decisions are best made and more readily accepted when they're made by a person of stature who is viewed as nonpartisan, and this was what it was supposed to be. The 40-year-old Brooklynite who's been nominated for this job or suggested got a degree in government at Cornell University. The archives are not something that he is really very familiar with. He is a political scientist. He's regarded as a political protege of Education Secretary William Bennett. who was acting chairman of the National Endowment for Humanities. Bennett, the endowment's former chairman, brought him to the staff in 1982 from the National Humanities Center in North Carolina, where the two worked under the right-wing arm, of course, of Jesse Helms down in North Carolina. Now, this fellow is very strong with Bennett. Bennett has very wild, politically conservative, and so-called Christian front ideas of the Reagan administration of the far right, and he would determine what papers we see, what's classified, if it's available, or even what is destroyed, which is a very serious problem, requesting something and it's not there, or marking it that you can't see it. So this crony of Reagan and Bennett's would be put into the National Archives. They've decided that he's the one they want. His name is front runner, and it is a very dangerous situation to let the person in power see that his mistakes are locked up so that historians can't study them. We'll take a 1-minute break and go back to some, what I think are very important things happening, the scenes behind the scenes right now, and continue along that line for one more half hour. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of a program called World Watchers, program number 755, in case you picked it up in the middle or the beginning or almost the end of the first half hour. Bibliography sheets are available of these broadcasts. The tapes are also available in case you want to have the tape and didn't tape it off the air. You can write to me, Mae, M-A-E, Brussell, just like it sounds, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922. And I'll give you the source of information for these particular stories. The very dangerous appointment, along with Harry Schauderman, like a soldier in place in Brazil, is the appointment of Frank Wiesner, who's been nominated to become the new ambassador to Egypt. Considering what is going on there, and my firm belief that Mubarak is being set up to be murdered and a military coup to be put into place, as if that wasn't a military coup when Anwar Sadat was murdered, but it's getting farther right. The far right that Nancy Reagan and Deaver are afraid of are ready to surface, and that far right surfaced in South Africa this week, where the whites were killing the whites and the swastikas were there, and I'll do more on that if I have time. The right will be killing the white on white, and the difference is being met looking at the barrel of a gun, and as I say, the symbols of the Fourth Reich are visible in South Africa as this slaughter is taking place, and now the countries are going farther right than they were before. The United States is pushing the president and the Secretary of State, and also this is taking place, sending Mr. Wiesner to Egypt at this time. Now, he doesn't have the name Frank Wiesner Jr., he doesn't have the number 2 after him, but he is indeed the son of the Wiesner who is described so well in John Loftus's book, The Balera Secret. Just a couple of references to his father. It describes, this is page 72, in the early days of the Office of Policy Coordination, Wiesner was the man in charge of it. He knew people in Washington. He was a man of independent wealth. He was familiar with the news media, which is very important for these operations, such as James Reston and Arthur Kroc of the New York Times, and members of the State Department and the Alsop brothers, and so forth, and British editors, and it cites their names. And Loftus says Wiesner was obsessed by an anti-communism that he had developed in his encounters with the Soviets in the Balkans, not the Nazis in the Balkans, and in post-war Germany, because Germany had lost to the Soviets, and it was the driving force behind the Office of Policy Coordination. He threw off ideas for rolling back the Soviet Empire like a human pinwheel. And this goes into the people that he worked with, such as Kermit Roosevelt, who was instrumental in helping overthrow Iran, getting rid of Mossadegh and putting in the Shah of Iran, Tracy Barnes of the CIA, Cord Meyer Jr., who now writes for Reverend Moon, and Arnaud de Borchgrave, and William Colby, who referred to them as an atmosphere of an order of Knights Templar, but these are the Knights of Malta, a great many of them are. By the summer of 1948, Loftus wrote, when Wiesner flew to Germany, circumstances combined to permit him to lay the groundwork for a unique intelligence operation. Now get these dates in terms of what I had on the air last week of the Kurt Waldheim story. In 1948, he flew to Germany to lay the groundwork for his unique operation. In 1948 is when the daughter of Alan Dulles, married the gentleman who recommended Kurt Waldheim to be the secretary of the foreign minister of Austria, where he could travel into Austria and to the United States and so forth. The presidential election was looking good. It was approaching. He was a dedicated Republican, hoping to have a Dewey victory. And, of course, when Truman got in, the wheels started rolling with Eisenhower and Nixon as the vice president. And when the two Kennedys were killed, Nixon took over the Dewey operations that were set up in these early years in 1948. He goes on to say, Wisner explained his plan to recreate the SS underground, that is the Gestapo SS, recreate their network in Eastern Europe, in Belarus or Russia, and in the Ukraine through General Clay in several lengthy meetings. And next week, I won't have time this week, I'm going right into the sabotage of the Chernobyl atomic plant and my belief more positive, and I'm putting together a lot of work to do just 1 hour on that. But they recreated the SS, and those people, I believe, are behind the lines in Russia that did this time to the Soviet Union. But Loftus writes, once those networks were revived, that's the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, with a 1,000-year Reich goal, they could be used to cache supplies of arms and equipment for special forces. Wiesner believed the Soviet Union would start to disintegrate from internal rebellions, and now they're having internal problems because of the atomic plant, and it didn't blow up, but the problems that they had there with the disaster that leaked the nuclear material into the air and around Russia, and it will bring not rebellions, but a lot of problems. What he wanted, he said, was only a matter of time before Western powers would be involved in war, World War III, and Wisner's underground armies would play a major role in helping overthrow the Soviet Empire. And Wiesner was very important in that. He said, you have to begin preparations immediately. But by 1950, that's when the Korean War began. That's when Otto von Bolschwing of the Waffen-SS came to this country and was hiring Helene von Damm from Austria in Sacramento to work for Reagan. He began his plans by 1950. He knew that many people he wanted to recruit were still being hunted. They were Nazis. They had pro-Nazi activities, and they had to be protected. The CIC, which is the organization that protected them, at the direction of Congress, was going to try to prevent Nazi war criminals from emigrating to the United States. The CIC was not obstructed. Wisner's training program was going on. It took place mostly in America, and he would be free to have his Nazi politicians recruit commando units to guide Western forces in future invasions of Russia, and we're just on the brink of that now. He could establish governments in exile, which is what we've done in all of these countries, and prepared even in South Africa and in Chile and in the Philippines. In case one falls, we have the other one, and they would assist with the occupation. Wiesner and General Clay were confident of Tom Dewey's election, and then they would be free to operate over the board. But because he didn't win, it was put more as a subterfuge or covert operation to bring the SS into the United States intelligence. And he said, after all, the Dulles brothers were key figures in the Republican election campaign. They were the most ardent supporters of OPC's political action program, which was to get ready for World War III. And until the defeat of Truman, it was essentially to use the Belarusian Nazis and so forth in our administration through John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And, of course, Allen Dulles was removed from John Kennedy because of that hidden government behind his back. And then he was put on the Warren Commission, and many of the Belarusian Nazis were involved working with our Defense Department in setting up the story of Oswald the Loner. So Mr. Wiesner, Frank Wiesner, the son, who's been working 20 years in the State Department, is ready to move into Egypt at this time, and Allen Dulles' daughter in 1948 married a man in Austria, Fritz Molden, Austrian publishing empire. So the links of Dulles in 1948 with his family, and of course he was in Bern, Switzerland from 1943 to 45, already setting up the Waffen-SS and planning their next moves. Just to summarize, because this is very, very important, Ronald Reagan is in the White House without Mr. Deaver, without William Wilson, without William Clark. George Bush can be pushed aside. The newspapers were having articles this week that Paul Laxalt is the favorite to become president. That was decided 25 years ago, by the powers that be, that Paul Laxalt would be the president. When I said that about Reagan, nobody believed me, but we'll see what happens with Laxalt's suit and his possible links to organized crime. I don't think crime is even a factor anymore. Look at the re-election of Jackie Presser after he was indicted for being the new president of the Teamsters. So the appointment of Mr. Schultz in Brazil, of Mr. Wisner in Egypt are very, very important. And again, the Haig, Kissinger, Kramer team are in the background, surfacing, having interviews. Haig is portraying himself as the liberal. He had articles this week, I wouldn't have bombed Libya like Reagan did. And he's pushing the Jewish vote, going to Hillcrest Country Club and the Jewish organizations. That's just one example in L.A. But very, very close to the Jewish group and to Israel, and pushing himself off as somewhat of a moderate when he was the one that was ordering the attacks against Gaddafi in 1981 and was ready to take over the country. If a coup had taken place, if the president had been murdered and died, he'd be working there with George Bush, and George Bush family was close to the Hinckley family, and he also was close to Francesco Pazienza and the plot to kill the Pope. That team are waiting in the sidelines as these other people are getting into very interesting connections. And a little bit more about Mr. Waldheim. There are as many articles out now about him as Deaver, but they're very important. I just want to cite one or two. One in the Washington Times. Again, very interesting, the amount of material that is coming out of that newspaper. And it's fairly cheap to get. If you're interested in the subjects I talk about, you really should subscribe to the Washington Times. The article is titled, Man Claims Waldheim Had a Torture Chamber. This is a gentleman named Joseph Weil who lives in Ferndale, New York, who spends a lot of time between Israel and New York. He was into forced labor in I can't pronounce the camp. Brest-Litovsk, Litovsk, in 1944. I should be able to pronounce that better, but I always get stuck on that one. He said he and 10 other Jewish forced laborers were housed in a building where Waldheim's offices were. He was ordered to clean them. In another room, there was a locked door. Waldheim had the key. No one went in, but it was a torture chamber. There were whips there, manacles fastened to the wall, and one day Waldheim asked Weil to go into this room, Joseph Weil, because there was Hebrew on the wall, and he wanted to read it, and it was written in blood. Evidently somebody was tortured or murdered in there, and before they died, it was written in blood. And Waldheim pointed at it and said, what does that mean? And he said it was Yiddish. It said, brothers and sisters, may those of you who survive avenge our blood. And he translated these words from Waldheim into German, and he was with him and at the Russian front, and Waldheim had a map of the Russian front with movements of the partisans, and next to the map he had a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And this man claims that he was very much part of these operations, and he was afraid of Waldheim. He was supposed to go with him as a translator because he spoke Hungarian, but he wouldn't go. He said when Waldheim was first proposed as Secretary General of the United Nations, Weil said, I stepped forward and offered to give information. No one was interested. Now that sounds like my trying to give information about Fritz Kramer, the mentor of Kissinger and Haig, working with Daniel Graham in Washington, D.C., this faceless, monocled German, and I've had no cooperation. A handful of researchers have helped me. Outside of that, I spent, when Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg, around $300 sending pictures and letters and mailings to every member of Congress. Never got an answer, and I sent them to Jewish organizations, and I want to do more about that next week also, not this on this broadcast. But I know what it is to reach out and try to tell people, and nobody listens. And Mr. Weil said that he worked with him and knew him, and that he ran. It opened that door, and he knew that people were taken for what they called prisoner interrogations and special tasks, and then they were moved on for torture, kidnapping, and execution, and the villages were burned. So this fellow is very familiar with the past of Waldheim. Also, another story, Waldheim charges are called serious. The State Department, Deputy Secretary of State John Whitehead is looking into the charges of Waldheim as a war criminal. Another article just this morning from the Los Angeles Times, Waldheim evidence merits trial, Israelis say. And they say that if he were there, he would certainly be tried as a war criminal. He was more than an accessory to the fact, and he has been linked to the actual sending off and extermination. And now he's listed in the records and documents as being a part of the torture, personal torture and interrogation of various people. The New York Times had a long article last week, May 16th. Wiesenthal faults the Jewish Congress on Waldheim. I gave you a few quotations of that, how Wiesenthal says that's not his style to go after these people. Wiesenthal, as I've said many, many times, is a total fraud, and that's how Fritz Kramer and Waldheim stay in this country. I've approached the Wiesenthal people, of course, about Mengele. They're notorious about that cover-up, and about Fritz Kramer, and now the Waldheim, you can see publicly the stand they take. The World Jewish Congress was put down by Simon Wiesenthal, and Mr. Singer was put down. So just this week, the World Jewish Congress displayed papers in which they said that Waldheim was wanted by the UN War Crimes Commission. He said, I released these papers to show you that it's not Jews going after Waldheim. It isn't vengeance like we are being accused, like Wiesenthal, of picking on Waldheim. He said, the reason we displayed this is to show we are not the accusers. The accusers are the UN War Crimes Commission. The World Jewish Congress has accused Waldheim of signing documents dealing with the killing of civilians in Yugoslavia, knowing about their deportations, also in Greece. So they presented those to show that they were not the accusers, that the documents exist accusing him of these crimes, and they are showing you the documents. Waldheim, as a response, hired a libel lawyer. He said he has a friend, Theo Petter, who will represent him. He says he doesn't want anybody ruining his reputation. That's what libel is, I suppose, and he'll take legal action if they say things that are untrue. But there are enough documents that will surface in England and Yugoslavia as they slowly ooze out to support the documents that exist, that it is a very serious matter, the background of Kurt Waldheim. The Monterey Herald, not the LA Times, had an article yesterday. Waldheim aid hits the witch hunt after the Israelis say evidence exists. And again, here he goes back to the original anti-Semitism, the man who wrote a paper on the resurrection of the Fourth Reich, and how they would follow Hitler, in glorifying Hitler in 1944 to get a degree at the university and praising the resurgence of Germany to save the world again. He now calls the Israelis on a witch hunt when it has surfaced that the United Nations has the record of his crimes, and the other papers should be released. Otherwise, you can't prove an unknown. But what is in England and also in the United States and Yugoslavia, I'm sure, would finalize the fact that he should be charged with murder. Now, just one quick subject I wasn't going to make a comment about, but I have to get in my 2 cents. That was the hands across America to aid the poor. It's very nice that they did it. I don't participate in a lot of this. I go to demonstrations of a kind. But I stayed away. Well, Monterey County didn't have, I guess I might have done if we had a section here. We actually didn't have it. But I watched Ronald Reagan holding hands with a few unknown people, children, I guess, of the staff around the White House. And the speech that he gave Saturday or a couple of days before about the poor, in a sense, Ronald Reagan, who I never defend, was absolutely right in what he said in this sense. He said, ignorance, not lack of aid, causes hunger. Now, Ronald Reagan, no matter what you think of him, as I say, you have to say he's right. Because any smart person would have known about Reagan and would have gone to the poll and voted, much less being reelected. If they couldn't do research on the 8 years in California, all they had to do is look at the first 4 years and every single cent that would alleviate poverty, that would go to health programs, that would go to education and agriculture, is put into the weapons system. Ronald Reagan took a budget and ran for office to balance it, and then doubled from George Washington through Jimmy Carter, and left us with this terrible debt that it hardly can ever be paid off. So ignorance is one of the causes of hunger, because people can vote. You don't have to be too schooled in what's going on. If you vote for Adolf Hitler, if you vote for Ronald Reagan, you are responsible for your own problems. And in that sense, he's absolutely right. If 40% of the country voted for him, or 43%, and most of them didn't vote at all, then it was total ignorance, even the ignorance of Jesse Jackson, to split the party the Democratic Party, or Geraldine Ferraro with her mafia connections to become vice president and not insist that Mr. Mondale get somebody who isn't recommended by Roy Cohn. Reagan, other headlines on the subject, quotations of Reagan. Reagan doesn't believe anyone going hungry due to the cutbacks. Well, it's not due to the cutbacks, it's due to the weapons contracts. And one is equal to the other. Cutting back isn't the problem of doing that, but then the deaths and the non-productivity of the warfare state is what's killing us off and closing the farms and closing the businesses and sending the steel overseas, buying imported steel, and our factories and manufacturing everything from our cat food to shoes and everything being brought in this country and buying more from foreign countries than we can sell out to other countries and increasing tremendous problems. Reagan also said another big quote in the newspaper, because I take so many. Reagan quotes, "The hungry just don't know where to go." And again, the hungry better go to the polls, because there was the Humphrey Hawkins bill for full employment. We should have a full health plan like Canada, and they don't know where to go. And that's why, that's one of the problems. And I'm not being cynical. Those old bag ladies you see around New York probably voted for Dewey. They voted for Eisenhower and Nixon. I'll bet you if you took a poll of their politics or didn't vote at all, if they were astute in knowing that they can just, before they ever got on the streets as bag people, or this terrible impoverished area in Virginia, the people should have some way of knowing that when an election comes, they do have some choices, and if they just stay home and have no choice, then they're ignorant, and Reagan is putting these people down, and the answer to a lot of this is education and getting people to know what control they have or don't have over their own lives. Mary McGrory had an article this week, "Go to Prison and Learn to Read." She's not aware of the power system. The whole purpose of the school system and the mill that they put people through is how not to read, to be illiterate. That's why 1/3 of this country today is actually illiterate. They don't know how to read, because if you read, you'd read some of the articles I cite on the air week after week, or the books that are out, or the publications that would change your life. As long as you stay illiterate and don't know what's going on, this is the control they have over you. And to think that they're going to send you to prison to learn to read, what if you decide to read George Jackson or some of the other material, the speeches of Salvador Allende or Malcolm X? What if you could read? Then the power structure would be in trouble. So they don't want you to read, and that isn't going to be the solution. Prison isn't going to teach you to read. They leave you a vegetable to make sure when you get out you're as illiterate as you went in. Now, about hands across America, I thought about war papers that were published just recently about Hirohito, some of the letters the Emperor of Japan wrote during the war. And he wrote to his eldest son blaming Japan's defeat on overconfidence of the people who misjudged the power of the United States and Britain. And one of these was cited in the newspaper recently. He wrote it September the 9th, 1945, after we had dropped the atomic bombs. He said, "The people of our country were overconfident of the imperial country and made little of Britain or the United States. Our military men placed too much significance on spirit and were forgetful of science." And this is exactly what happens with We Are the World, or Feed Africa, or AIDS for Africa. Help the farmer. Hey, it's great. Everybody's holding hands. They're rubbing shoulders. They're doing the Leo Busaglio love story. Love will conquer all. I hear this all the time. It's the spirit that conquers it. When you're looking down the barrel of a gun, it isn't the spirit at all. There are private armies in the United States. There are private armies in the Philippines, armed with billions of dollars coming in, not millions, but billions, to overthrow these various countries. And it takes more than the spirit of people holding hands and singing. They're not psychically going to bring these forces down to their knees. It's not going to solve the dangerous world debt. This subject is going on all the time, and what is happening in the United States is not going to be solved by holding hands and singing "We Are the World." We ain't nothing, and those people don't know it, and they have an overblown intention that they are self-important. Love is an energy force like electricity, and I believe in love as a force, but it has to be a genuine love, and to love your country and love people, you have to invest time and energy. You have to read. You have to study. You can't just be depressed about it. Any social change came through a lot of hard work, and a lot of people who were gunned down, like the Kennedys and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and Che Guevara and Adlai Stevenson, and people that Ralph Bunche of the UN or Dag Hammarskjöld, Olof Palme. These peacekeepers are put down by guns. They have plenty of love, but they don't meet love. And in order to spread love, you have to know the science of the bullets and the ballistics and how the peacekeepers are never allowed to live. And someday, few will catch on, not enough know now, and the other are cowards and go back to groups like the EST or these institutes that teach you to love each other, and that will solve the world problems. Now, a friend who listens to World Watchers brought me a book this week, 2 scrapbooks that belonged to her husband. He passed away several years ago, and he kept a record of events that took place from the time the atomic bomb fell. She brought me 2 of the 4 scrapbooks. She has to look in the attic for the other 2. And these are news accounts that are priceless of where the mindset of our government and our military were when World War II was over. And throughout the weeks for years to come, I'll share these with you and give you the dates, and maybe you can go to the library and photocopy some of these, but they're just wonderful, and I might try to photocopy them and get them out in book form for you. One of the articles was printed October the 19th, 1945. The bomb fell in August. The title of the article is First Atom Bomb Suit for Ruined Peaches, filed by Salem County, this is Salem, New Jersey, for $400,000. And these are orchard owners in New Jersey who blamed the atomic bomb for ruining the peach crop in 1944. The bomb didn't drop until 1945, but the peach trees, the leaves were falling off, the trees were dying, and goodness knows what the people got in them. And there was uranium in the system. They got chemists to check the uranium, and near them was a DuPont factory. DuPont was processing to make uranium. The bomb didn't just happen in Los Alamos, where it was exploded the first time in July 45. The DuPonts had factories in New Jersey, the Sun Oil Company, and General Chemical Company. Those are 3 companies they sued. But they couldn't sue until the first bomb was dropped because the government counter-espionage came to them and shut them up. They didn't know what the firm was making. Now, DuPont is the organization behind Advanced Genetic Sciences, with putting this bacteria on our strawberry, and goodness knows what secrets there are there. The Sun Oil is run by the Pugh family, and Mr. Senholtz on the board of Western Goals is a part of the this operation, the Sun Oil Company, and they sued these 3 companies, this particular group from Camden, New Jersey. And the attorney said that the peach growers noticed that they had to hire chemists to find that there was hydrogen fluoride fumes in the vicinity and near their hometowns, and free uranium they found, the basis of the atomic bomb that they were making in farmlands and where people lived, the orchards, the homes, just like AGS was going to test their bacteria right here in Castroville, right next to homes and schools and so forth, and put the live bacteria. So the government came to them and said, you can't sue. They hired an attorney in Philadelphia, and it was all very secret. And they said, being, of course, patriotic, we said nothing except to the DuPonts. And in return, the government, on information from the firm, sent a counter-espionage officer after us. We delayed our action until the fact of the atomic bomb was made public. And then they sued. They couldn't do anything until the bomb was dropped, but here are people that could lose their lives at that time. Now, October 17th in the New York Times, 1945, the announcement the atomic bomb could kill 40 million people. That's at that time. And we have increased the amount and the weight of, not the weight, but the quality of the bombs, so they're much, much larger. In 1945, Mr. Oppenheimer was saying he's afraid of it, but it is true that a single night's raid on America could kill 40 million people in the congested cities if the bomb fell then. Now, another important item, well, I don't have too much time now, but I just want to mention that the NATO countries are concerned that Ronald Reagan is pushing to increase chemical, biological warfare, and some of the NATO countries don't want it. 6 of the 14 are against it. And what Reagan wants, Reagan gets, and the Senate has to have a vote very soon on what is called the disarray of NATO, because the United States is going to produce these weapons that we haven't had since 1969. Caspar Weinberger said, I intend to go through with the plan to have binary gas, and this is an issue in the news in 1986. In 1946, 40 years ago in January, a large article in New Yorker magazine, and you might look this up, January 13th, 1946, and also in the New York Times, bacterial warfare poses a problem as hard to solve as that of the atomic bomb. And this is a long article, but time is almost out. I'll read you some of it, because it was interesting to me to get these reprints from these old newspapers, because I said that there's so many people in the nuclear freeze marching against atomic bombs, children afraid of atomic bombs. They are getting in their food and in their air and in their water purposeful as well as coincidental chemicals that will cause their death right now. It isn't coming from the sky. You are ingesting it. I bet 1 out of every 3 people is ingesting stuff at the present time. A long subscriber to World Watchers asked me to do some segments on the radiation of food, and I'll do that next week for her. Any of you long listeners that have requests like that want more on that, I save these articles. But they knew in 1946 that bacterial warfare against large masses of population was the important story, not necessarily the atomic bomb. On the one hand, one is saying 40 million will die from that. On the other hand, 20 million are dying of AIDS in central part of Africa right now as a weapon. 4,000 scientists got together as soon as World War II was over, and within 6 months were ready to go into the bacterial warfare, which is a horrendous thought, thinking of the power and connection, say, of just AGS that I've been talking about, to the international companies, to Roman Haas, to IG Farben, to the plans for genocide and extermination from World War II that continued here. But the time is out now. I'll do more on this later and get back to these subjects. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week. And I want to thank you again for the mail, the letters, the articles, and the tape cassettes of other radio programs you're sending me. I really appreciate them very much. You take care, and we'll be back to continue next week.